Markets. No, there is something quite different. People of those markets are unashamed of liking hard work, and I just love the robustness of it all.
Yeah. Get the cowboy out of me.
The light that comes in is not direct. It comes from a skylight, so it's soft. As a photographer, I love the colors that melt into one another. I looked at the marketplace, the area that I love best, and it reminded me of a Bruegel painting. A man with his earthy hands, his worn leather apron, a face that makes me think that that man has a sense of his own origin.
Going out tonight?
What are you doing?
No, I guess I'll just take my little old horn down to the pub and have a blow.
Oh, yeah?
Well, it's a damn good night. You ought to come down. A lot of laughs. It's nothing like a good blow.
You trying to be dirty?
I don't know whether I want to screw her at all.
However, if a black cattleman has a herd of 600 cows together enclosed in a corral, he will know at a glance, without even counting, that 2 cows are missing. We still have rudiments of this ability. If, for example, a mother with 6 children is loading suitcases on a train in a crowd at the station, and one of the children escapes to the milk bar, that mother would know with a single glance, without counting, that one is missing.
Tol tu ngarawanga, na ko don jang ngarapin, kabay ngon malay rakko, ngarapin ang kanya, ngarajal, kung nga ana, ngarain to kung ngayon.
Mr. Malila, you were not called to the stand. Mr. Miliripi, could you please make this clear to Mr. Malila?
Your Honour, I'm a fry. I cannot speak his language.
The plaintiff, Mr. Malila, was introduced to the court as mute at the start of these proceedings. I feel slightly confused. Is there anyone among the plaintiffs or witnesses who can translate?
The situation, Your Honour, is this man is the sacred custodian to the secrets of his tribe, and his tribe has died out. He is the sole and final survivor of his people, his clan. They call him the mute because there's nobody left on this earth for him to speak with.
Welcome to everybody. Before we start, I really want to recognise the unique position of Aboriginal people in Australian culture and history, and to pay respect to the traditional owners and custodians of the land we're on, the Eora people of the Gadigal Nation, and their elders past, present and future. We acknowledge the vital role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play within our community, despite a frequent lack of respect from some of our political leaders. Tonight, we have a wonderful opportunity. We will celebrate the life and the films of Michael Edols, someone who many of us have known for so long. Thank you all for coming and being part of this event. Documentary makers are a very particular community. It's really quite difficult for many people to understand why we spend our lifetimes devoted to our explorations and our ideas and our art. I think tonight may provide some answers. For me, researching and organising this event has been a huge pleasure, not only because I counted Michael as a friend, but because for me, this event is an invaluable Australian history and film study. This evening, Michael's friends and colleagues will be sharing with us their knowledge and memories of the filmmaker, the man, his collaborations, his motivations, his methods, and his idiosyncrasies. His wife and partner, Marion van der Dreischen, is with us and will speak last. Michael's early Kimberley films, Lalai Dreamtime, Floating Like Wind Blow 'Em About, and When the Snake Bites the Sun, are absolutely groundbreaking works, as many of us know. International benchmarks in filmmaking, and also in the way they presented Aboriginal society and Aboriginal people, internationally and nationally. I'd like to say that at the moment, we've got a table with Andrew Pike, who's got a marvellous set of Michael's films called Aspects of a Life, and they are for sale outside after the show and probably while we have a drink, which we'll be doing at the Bavarian Beer Cafe as soon as this is over, as soon as the open mic session's finished. I guess I'd say that in our current era, where television documentary form and approach is prescribed by the broadcasters rather than the creators, we need more than ever people with vision. Michael Edols was one.
Gak biji.
Oh, this one.
Kau dah jumpa bawah. Oh, tunggu mana kau tunggu. Jual. Eh, un mau gue kan kalau mau. Turun ke. Kor kuning, kor. Mahal pe ya. Pagare mana ya
What about that? There's no presenter, there's no hand-holding narration, there's storytelling through imagery, through empathy with the people filmed. We'll see a lot like that tonight. And I want to thank the film school, the AFTRS, for the theatre, for the projectionists, for the facilities. And I'd really like to ask our first guest, Jennifer Isaacs, to come up and say a few words about Michael and her knowledge of him in the very beginnings, if you could, Jennifer.
Well, it's a very difficult evening for all of those of us who loved Michael. Marion, probably the most. My husband and I, David and I, knew Michael for 50 years as in his artist mode, as personally, as a young man with a young child, through many of his great movies, and he lived in our house and with us and in a circle of friends in the late 1960s and 70s, many of whom have gone down in Australian film history. And knowing I was going to come and just say a few words tonight has made me think about that time and how extraordinary it was and how many extraordinary figures that turned out of that group. I mean, to start the picture, it was the 70s, so the first time I saw Michael was in 1970. I knew about him, but he was at Woodstock was in 69. Orimba was in 70. That was the first Australian outdoor rock concert, and some of you might have been there. I can see a few people who might have, like us. And so probably the entire Commonwealth Film Unit was out there too, because we were all wagging work and going and having a good time. Some were topless, and Michael was one of them. But he happened to be up on stage. And to set the scene and just get your memories going to what era this is and what Michael was like in that time, because I'll talk a bit about his personality at the time as well. The times were fun and fast. We all had long hair, mine to my waist, We loved music and film and food and lived in a number of communal residencies around the inner suburbs, Paddington, Balmain, and we were in Glebe. A ragtag group of intensely arty types, photographers, filmmakers, a potter or two, the beginnings of the Aboriginal Islander Dance Theatre, and at my house, because I was heading the Aboriginal Arts Unit at the Australia Council for the Arts, an endless and interesting group of visiting people from all cultures of the world, but particularly from all the remote Aboriginal communities. Michael found us and hardly ever went home. I often feel guilty that the intensity and excitement of the group that gathered was what held him there. But the first time I saw him work was a little before then, and that was out at Arimba. And the bands that were on, that might bring back a few things to you. Billy Thorpe and the Aztecs, Wendy Saddington, Tully, Stevie Wright, Nutwood Rugg, and Michael in action at the front of it, carrying a huge, heavy cameras as they were in those days, and like a crab, without his shirt on, covered in sweat, crawling on the edge of the stage, around and amongst them, holding this thing in one hand and capturing the most amazing, active and interesting photographs the whole way through in continuous takes. And I think we're going to hear a little bit more technically about his incredible reputation that came with him when he went first to the Commonwealth Film Unit. We lived in Tom Cowan's house for a while, where a lot of this happened, and you know, we were a group that loved film. We went to the Australian Film Co-op where many experimental films were happening. We bought food at the fish market, hence Michael's beautiful imagery. He went there and shopped very often, and to Paddy's in Chinatown then. And dinners, parties and film going were what we did. Tom, and of course the heavyweights on top of the unit, Malcolm Otten, I'm saying a few names, Dick Mason, Don McAlpine, Keith Gow, Peter Tammer, Kit Guyot, Anthony Wallace, Brian Hannon, John Rhodes, Sandra Levy, Lee Chittick. They just all came through. We had a great time. Michael was universally admired. More than that, they were in awe of his skill. He, on the other hand, in person, was quite a fragile character. And I became a sort of mentor, big sister, mother, whatever you like. He needed strong women to lean on because he'd lost his own mother in very tragic circumstances by being sent to Australia at 10. I don't know where she was, and I'd love to hear more if anyone, Marion, knows the story, because we don't from that era. And he, at one point, he was even longing to find a mother who had been a Dayak in the longhouses where he grew up in Borneo. But I think the story ended up quite differently. So he was almost an orphan in Australia, and we became a sort of family. Although he was, by that stage, married to Pauline, and he soon had Ben, his son. And we obviously saw a great deal of him. He met, as I said, so many Aboriginal people at my place, including David Moljali, who was the star of that film you saw a clip of just then. And he, it has to be said, in today's language, he was couch surfing all the time, because in every room we had were couches and mattresses, and the occupants were a sort of moving feast, really. At that time, I can remember when Michael was staying, Jeff Doring came to see me, and Jeff, of course, made the wonderful Titikawa and Friends in Papua New Guinea. And Jeff came to cry on my shoulder about not having a cameraman anymore when he was due to leave the next day. And I saw Michael heading up the stairs, and I said, "There's the best cameraman I've ever seen. Grab him now." So like a fisherman with a net, Jeff reeled him in, and off they went to do, and that became Titikawa. And with that, we gained the most wonderful cinematography and the award, of course, for that film. Michael said himself later that doing that film was when he realised he was more than what was the nature of the title of the job at the time of cameraman, but I was a storyteller, or auteur. I read that on his site today, and that was a beautiful moment where I saw where he had cited that himself at that time. And it also gave me a clue to why along the route of his life's journey, that extraordinary eye and skill of storytelling meant that although he was the most wonderful cinematographer, he was also quite hard for directors to manage. And I'm sure there'd be a few in this room who might have had trouble. I did too. Michael, the man. Indomitable, yes. Maybe relentless, indefatigable. Sensitive, absolutely. Gentle, loving, and with a heart like you wouldn't believe. He had a huge heart. When I wrote that in these notes, it made me think of the desert people who pronounce that word art as heart. And in Michael, those two things come together perfectly. His art was his heart and his art was his heart. I mean, you know what I mean. Was he a flawed genius? I don't think so. I just think he was a genius, and genii often take a lot of time for other people to catch up with, and invariably they burst the budget. But what do we get in return? Like, the gifts he's left this nation are extraordinary, and we should value them hugely. Those who have trod the path of being an outsider, recording Aboriginal thinking and culture, and giving them a voice through the lens of an auteur, are many. However, they're not necessarily appreciated today if you're not a dispossessed person yourself. I know of this because I've trod this path myself, as have many in this room. But Michael's childhood attests that he himself was a dispossessed, and the empathy he felt, which he describes so beautifully in many occasions, of going bush with Aboriginal people in far and remote places, camping outside, sleeping under the stars, the camaraderie, the family, the friendship that happens, and the vision of the universe from a different perspective was his from up until the age of 10. So imagine what that does to the psyche. He was a different person. He looked for something different and new in everyone he loved, all the women in his life. You know, there weren't any boring skippies, you know what I mean? He looked for just incredible genuineness. His major Aboriginal trilogy, which Nick mentioned, is our strongest bond. I knew all the players in this saga. I knew all the people that you saw the images of by name and as friends. I nursed him through a lot of all that, not so much the ins and outs of Lalai Dreamtime, which was relatively easy, but still to me seems rather romantic, beautiful, but still of its day. But looking at it again recently, I remember in the 70s I thought that, because, you know, I was a harder head political animal. I was mixing a lot also with Redfern types, Gary Foley, you know, all that crowd. The Tent Embassy was happening. And Michael was like a lyrical poet, a beautiful man making chili crab in the back garden in a wok. But now I think those films are a direct precursor to some of the hard-hitting Indigenous filmmaking of today, like Warwick Thornton's Samson and Delilah. Why? They're so vastly different and such vastly different subjects. They're acted films. They're subtitled, yet they capture the inside thinking of the Aboriginal characters who are playing themselves. If not themselves in their current life, then certainly the life they know about. And so the conversations, when translated, are so real and authentic. And therefore, they're very genuine artistic documents of a period that we no longer can see. In Michael's case, he was giving a voice to the dispossessed, as he says himself, and in that case, Sam Woolagudja, to preserve sacred paintings and revive the spirit of those paintings with renewing them. That was the most extraordinarily beautiful spiritual thing that we saw in his lyrical way he dealt with Samuel Ogudja in the cave. I urge you all to please look at that. The third of those films, and here I'm touching on the biggest pain in his life. I feel I want to do that at the beginning because it happened in the 1970s. The third of the films was meant to be a sojourn in which he took Samuel Ogudja to Indonesia and sailed with him back to Australia in a large Indonesian handmade boat of wood, because the Wandjina spirit story had them coming over the sea from Indonesia and coming to the coast of the Kimberley. So Samuel Ogudja was desperate and excited to go and retrace that spiritual journey with Michael. They set off from the Kimberley and arrived in Sydney, but the trip was not to happen. Samuel Ogudja died, as we all know, in Sydney, not 6 hours after Michael and Sam left our house at North Sydney, where Sam had been sweetly talking to my 2-year-old son, also named Sam. Samuel Ogudja had a heart attack and died almost immediately in Michael's arms. And for years, Michael bore rejection and shame and blame. No more. He tried valiantly to do everything in his power to help fix the tragic effects in that community, but he carried it heavily. My perspective, looking at both sides and moving through the Kimberley as well and hearing about it for decades really, was there was also a split in attitudes in the community in the Kimberley. New people who didn't know Michael personally, who increasingly had modern political views on race, saw him as a bad man who kidnapped an elder, who died and his spirit was lost in Sydney. But the older men, still there, they spoke in beautiful ways about this extraordinary scenario. As one man from the Kimberley spoke to me, he said, "That old man died there, his spirit is still not resting. So he's jumped into the nearest person who loved him, and that was Michael." He used the phrase, and we all know it from sort of our reading, if not our practice, he's riding him, and he pointed to his back. So the spirit was here in Michael, of Samuel Ogudja. I'm sure we'll hear tonight how Michael eventually found peace. He did make a third film, and it is like a reconciliation type film going back, but it was much more profound than that, and maybe continued in some ways, I don't know. Loss is very final sometimes. Yet, isn't it very Aboriginal how Michael finished his days? Michael left us exactly the same way as Samuel Ogudja. It's poignant. And isn't it also amazing that the joy he found in the last phase of his life with Marion was in finding the sea again through a long journey, restoring and sailing in a beautiful wooden boat that he never could do with Sam. Vale, much love, Michael.
Thank you, Jen. I'd like to introduce Max Hensser, who's not here tonight. Max, as probably many of you know, worked with Michael a lot, and particularly up in the Kimberley on the early films, particularly on the first 2 films. And Max can't be here tonight because he's become an artist. He's after, what was it, 50 years as a location sound recordist all over the world, working on films from Stanley Kubrick's films to I'm trying to think of those extraordinary films he was on when I first met him. He did films on art films with Tim Storia. He did. He's done so much. I'm sorry, for the moment it's just left my head. But he's been a painter for the last while, and he's got his first exhibition opening tonight. So he said, "I'm really sorry that I can't be there. I've got to be at my own art exhibition opening," which he is. And so he said, that's okay, but somebody can film me. And I said, okay, I'll do that. So could you run the clip of Max talking about his work with Michael?
Hello. It's a great pleasure to share a little of my friendship with our wonderful friend and storyteller, Mike Edols. I met Mike in 1972. I just recorded the sound on a documentary called New Guinea Culture Shock, directed by Jane Eyre and her husband Ian Stocks, who'd shot it. And we just arrived in Australia a few months earlier. With my fellow filmmakers, we went to a screening of a documentary called Tidikawa and Friends, also shot in New Guinea. And that's where I met Mike Edols, who had filmed that documentary. The cinematography blew me away. Breathtaking imagery and a handheld camera which seemed to be ahead of the action all the time. I met Mike and he saw our film and invited me to go with him to a remote place called the Kimberleys in Western Australia and help tell the story of the Aboriginal Woonan kinship system there, in effect to explore the meaning of the dream time. I was about 26 years old and jumped at the opportunity to share this adventure and learn about this whole culture about which I knew absolutely nothing. Michael's energy and enthusiasm for this project was extraordinary. He introduced me to Les McLaren, who was a young production manager and assistant, and the three of us flew off to Derby in Western Australia with a lot of 16mm film equipment after doing a lot of pre-production ourselves, which went on for about a month beforehand, and we met an Aboriginal elder who would change our lives. In preparation for this tribute to Mike, I've reread my journals from that time. I'm a bit of a compulsive journal writer, and the whole experience was incredibly challenging technically, physically, and emotionally. Michael was confronted with scenarios every single day and had to lead us through obstacles which would have defeated almost anyone else. We took a bush radio, a generator, and a whole tribal kinship group, and somehow, by light aircraft and an old pearling lugger, we arrived via various land routes and remote islands to the land of the Wandjina, Aboriginal ancestor spirits. The idea was that, led by their respected elder, this group would shed their 20th century identities and return in their dress and relationships to hunting and gathering, to the life they had lived before the advent of white occupation. I want to read from my journal, written at the time, as I think this short excerpt illustrates, to some extent, the challenges Mike took on and overcame to realise his extraordinary achievement with Lalai Dreamtime and Floating, the two documentaries that were made concurrently about life in the Dreamtime and about the life those people were experiencing on their Presbyterian church mission in Derby. His documentary drama series eventually was called When the Snake Bites the Sun. And it developed cultural bridges honouring ancestral heritage, which was Michael's absolute goal in making these films. I'll read to you a little from, bear with me please. So this particular day we've made camp on this beachhead, thousands of kilometres from anywhere. We have no vehicles, we have no plane, we have no boat, we've got a generator, we've rigged up our radio aerial in the trees, and the three of us and 14 Aboriginal people are attempting to make this documentary about the Dreamtime. Mike carries his 16mm very heavy French camera on an adapted rucksack frame with a welded base plate which bolts into the base of the camera, his tripod, a water bag, a 300mm lens in a case, and a billy of red beans for our tucker. One of the Aboriginal men carries a red shoulder bag containing foam rubber, spare mags, sound tapes, and I, the Nagra 1/4-inch tape recorder, my gun mic, headphones, auto slate, a bag with accessories and tapes. And soon we're going to set off to start to film this sequence about the kangaroo, hunting the kangaroo. And at that moment, Les sees a brown snake under a rock by my tent. We're looking for it, now about 11 a.m. Suddenly Les shouts, "Hey!" and I turn and a flame 15 feet high is leaping over our open kitchen. And I shout, "Bushfire!" and run and stop and run back and grab my towel and dunk it in a bucket of cold water. And Mike runs up from where he's been working on the generator. And we're all beating at the flames, but are forced back. And then an area 10 feet square is aflame. And then 20 feet, then 40 feet. And Sam, the old man, comes running through the bush, hair aflame with red ochre and tomahawk in hand, and our camp is in danger, and the fire spreads amazingly fast through the grass and up into the pandanus trees. We are mostly in bare feet and shorts, and drenched in sweat, beating at the flames, red-hot air on our skins. And one of the Aboriginal men, a real warrior, Barney, is leaping at the flames with sacking and smothering them. Two of the girls are gawking open-mouthed, and I shout, "Come on, grab some things and take them out down to the beach," because the wind has strengthened and is coming off the land at great speed, will engulf all unless we move it out. And we grab the generator and batteries and lug them out, and then the tents come down, Mike's tent beginning to melt and burn. One eye on the flames at our backs, throwing everything into rucksacks and boxes and carrying them out as fast as possible, and still beating at the flames with wet towels, and now working as a team. The Aboriginal men, Sam and Barney, and Mike, Les and I, led by the old man, begin making fire breaks, tearing the pampas and spinifex out with our hands about 20 feet away from the wall of flames and setting fires the other way, so that the fire meets fire in one huge burst of heat, searing 20 feet up into the gum trees. Yet to no avail. By 3 o'clock, hours later, exhausted and black and scratched and cut and singed, Les and I walk trembly and weak-limbed back down the long, tired-out beach while probably 100 acres burn behind us. The whole of Woodingara has gone up in fire, and it has leapt away up into the bush country too, smoke over all. I fall gratefully into the cool, salty ocean and feel it burning into scratches and burns and cuts and cleansing me, as did the fire baptism in a way. Our camp and equipment and all our first 4 days' work ruined. Even the radio aerial, which took us a morning to put up, had to be pulled down, and now it's all strewn all over the beachhead, and Mike and Sam lie exhausting, sleeping under mangrove bushes covered in flies. That was really just the beginning. We had to overcome that. It was really disaster, but Michael rallied us all, and we went on to make what is arguably one of the best films ever made about the dream time. So with those words, it gives you a taste, and I'm very happy to have shared that with you. Vale, Michael, thank you for bringing me the most amazing experiences, and you've affected my life and the lives of everybody here today immeasurably. Thank you.
And thank you, Max. At that point, I also asked Max to give me an idea himself about how an outsider like Michael going up there at that time managed to connect, managed to get the extraordinary level of profound empathy and trust in a community, and asked him what he thought was the way that Michael went about doing that.
Michael identified very strongly with people who perhaps were seeking their true identity, their true home, to be where they really did belong. And he, first of all, had visited that community earlier, and he had talked to the elders of that community at great length, and to the elders of the church there, and had persuaded them that he was a genuine storyteller, that he would respect everybody's part in their stories. And for the Aboriginal people there, Michael understood very, very strongly the importance to them of passing on their traditional law, their traditional way of living to their young people, which was in great danger of being lost completely. And to the credit of the man who ran the church there in Derby and ran that community, he 100% agreed to that proposition. So I think it was from his own personal past experience that Michael wanted to help these people tell that story.
I'll just mention that the Stanley Kubrick film that Max worked on was A Clockwork Orange. He also was the location sound recorders for Tamu, the story of Donald Friend in Bali. Of course, Lala Dreamtime and Floating, The Birdmen of Kilimanjaro, which won the AFI Best Sound Award, Art from the Heart, the Richard Moore film, and An Artist in Egypt with Tim Storia. But now I just wanted to introduce Les McLaren, who was famously introduced by Max at that point. And if you could come up, Les, and perhaps sit here, because I was going to say, if apart from anything else, I'd love you to, I know that I've known Les for quite a long time too, and Les is a wonderful editor as well as filmmaker. And the first film I saw of Les's was, I think you were an ethnomusicologist in Papua New Guinea, weren't you?
Yes.
Yes. And the first film I saw when I met Les was an extraordinary film of the highlands and bird life, and absolutely experimental approach to storytelling in the same way as Michael was doing in some ways, but different, but the same sort of thing that infused us all at that time, as Jenny was saying. I mean, in the late 60s and early 70s, nothing that had ever gone before was good enough. You had to make new ways of doing everything. And I think Les was doing that in the Highlands and in other parts of New Guinea. And I think that it was quite extraordinary because I was away, but then Les actually got tied up. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got involved with Michael and how that happened?
Okay. First of all, I was working as an editor in Port Moresby in 1971. When Michael came through to work on Titty Carver and Friends, and I caught up with him a couple of years later in Sydney, where I was able to show him the first film I'd made up there about the encroachment of modernity into a Highlands village. And it had very little voiceover, only from a person within the community, and the rest of it was a montage of images and the use of a lot of music. So he saw that and he liked it, and on the basis of that he invited me to work on the Kimberley's project.
And then, so when you went there with him, how did you find the sort of the situation you were in compared with Papua New Guinea in the Kimberley? What did you have? What did you discover that was different or similar?
Oh, it was totally different.
Okay.
Totally different. Arriving in Derby, I don't know if anybody's been to one of those remote places that has an Aboriginal settlement on the outside there. It's like a huge drama occurring in slow motion, in quiet, silent little moments. And so we arrived at this community, there's about 200 people. You go through the gates, there's a missionary's house and admin buildings and a collection of corrugated iron huts. And there's a real sense of torpor, and there's really not much happening apart from some kids running around. And there was this deep concern from the elders in the community about what was happening to their collective identities. They could see them evaporating because the Nawandjil in the community was the end result of 50 plus years of Presbyterian mission activity in that area from very early, if not first contact, with 3 different tribal groups who were brought together under mission influence, shifted to another area, then shifted again to Derby and put between a highway and the airport, 7 miles from town. And they were a long way from their home. And so there were fully initiated elders who were in the senior group, but there were these kids who really all they knew was urban fringe dwelling, and they had no language and they knew even less about culture. So that's the circumstance we arrived into.
And can you tell us a bit, Les, about what was your experience in all that time working with Michael? Tell us, you know, Max told us a great story about the bushfire and everything else, and how he was carrying that pack that was bolted to a ground plate for a camera. But what was it like actually, you know, the idiosyncrasies of Michael, the way you work with him? Can you tell us something?
Well, it was idiosyncratic, yes. Before the Kimberleys, I worked with Michael for a few weeks on a small series about sacred sites that we filmed in West New South Wales, South Australia, Perth, Port Hedland as we worked our way up to the Kimberley. So I was shooting sound, there was just the two of us, so we got to know each other a bit. Whenever people used to talk about Michael, they'd say, my God, that guy's talented. And then they'd say, but difficult. And it was the word that was nearly always associated with Michael. He wasn't easy to work with for most people. I think at one point I held the world record of working with him 18 months on the Kimberley's project. But look, he was passionate. He was like the tormented artist in a way, wounded by his past, but passionate about things that he valued. And they were to place value on other experiences, other knowledge, other people's situations. And he was fun as well. And a good cook as well.
And he's a cook, that's right, that's right. So what did you have in your mind, or did Michael have in his mind that you knew of as a filming plan for starting this?
Well, it's hard to make, well, okay, it's a long time ago, and how do you make sense? I mean, you see a film and it all works kind of, and surely it was meant to be like that. Getting there is not so easy. The filming took place in 4 parts. We were at the mission for a while, then we went bush to film where Max described. We went back to the mission, and then we did a final shoot off in the new cattle station, which was to be the economic base of the outstation they were going to build. And Michael has written in this little book here, actually, that the first period of shooting at Marion was pretty much wasted, trying to come to terms with what is going on here, how on earth do you approach this? But bit by bit, with persistence, I think the essential thing was to get the voice of the people. That was it. We were there to try and tell their story. And we arrived with an idea that there might be 3 films, the past, the present, and the future of this community. And so in terms of getting the voice, the challenge was then to try and find imagery and sound that would help evoke a vivid representation of their lives and to draw meaning out of that.
And you were filming to some extent concurrently, Max was saying, with the 2 in that project, which became Floating and La La Dreamtime. But thinking about Floating, the material you were first gathering, was that mostly coming eventually to be Floating?
Yes, look, the clear division pretty much is what's urban and what's bush.
Yeah.
So there are a few bits of the bush material from La La that are included into Floating.
Okay.
You get that intercut in that first sequence.
Mm.
So it's borrowed a bit from the La La shoot. But
yeah.
They were 2 quite, in a way, separate projects, although linked with similar, including some of the same people in both.
Sure. Alan, could we have a look at the next clip, Floating?
You know me, Henry?
Yeah, I know you.
You chased me with a axe one time ago. Back in going from Monkey Creek up to, what's the name, you know, just...
Yeah, I made you walk 94 miles, didn't I?
Yeah, you did, bro.
Put you down on the ground with the axe.
Yeah,
you
chased me with an axe.
Yeah, wouldn't do it you was told.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what that was.
I was about 16 young fellas in there, but I was only 16. Didn't learn my works, you know. I didn't know how to work. That's why
You sure learned how to work, didn't you?
No, you showed me how to work.
That was 1966, this is 1973, isn't it? Eh? And I'll tell you what, after all these years, you still respect me, don't you?
Got a respect for you and me.
Yeah.
I know you. And
that's the old blackfellow way, isn't it?
Yeah, that's in the blackfellow ways. Remember you make us all from the, you know how many of us?
Yeah.
That was my Mrs. Macy Yakai.
Yeah. Toby.
And me, Jackie Charles.
Yeah.
Dobby and the old Marion.
I mean, you reckon she'd die on the trip. I said to her, die on the trip. I don't care.
We had
a little lesson, didn't we?
One order bag of water.
And now today, you come and respect me, right?
I apologize to him.
As a brother.
To you, John.
As a brother, right?
Okay.
Right.
And
that's the respect of the boys in the Kimberleys, right? That just shows you a little bit of axe work or something like that and everything like that.
We was working for Mr. Crockett, you know Crockett? Yeah. He had a son named Bert.
so much to say. I guess we need twice as long as this from all this work, but the ideas there, the conceptual ideas are fabulous. The way the story is told through different ideas of setting up situations, almost homage to Sergio Leone or something, perhaps, I don't know. But all that sort of thing, and the intercutting of the elements that are around in the time. Can you tell us a little bit about it? You did the first cut on these films, didn't you? Tell us a little bit about how you approached it and how Michael and you fed into each other's ideas about things like that extraordinary clip.
Yeah. I think we had a common idea of hopefully ending up with something like that. So after syncing it and assembling it all, then we started to rough cut certain sequences. We had a couple of small screenings in Canberra and Sydney early on. And bit by bit we structured a loose assembly. But the whole thing was always trying to how to get the greatest strength out of the image. It's not a literal image, it's something representing a circumstance, and how do you try and give presence to that circumstance and the human story behind it. Yeah.
So the idea of approaching the shoot at this time, I also noticed when I first saw those films the difference that has become lately in terms of documentary anyway. I generally see people, crews are shooting for coverage, and I don't think Michael was shooting for coverage. I think he was always selecting shots. He knew where he was going. It might be a close-up and a pan to another close-up. It won't be just a cut from a wide shot to a medium shot to a close-up. It really is choosing the way you shoot when you come to a situation, and then when you edit it, who comes up with the ideas of let's put a gunfight into it?
Well, there's a couple of questions there. Look, Michael had those skills. He could do wide shot, close up, but he could do all that stuff. The gunshot, the shootout. Look, probably the most interesting thing happening for a lot of people out of that community was the horses and cattle, which they had a small activity there, and the pub and the movies. That was where the fun was. And so you could see, especially in this younger generation, up to people in their 20s, 30s, that this was the shaping environment. That's what their heads were. They were listening to Creedence Clearwater and Elvis, and they were going to the movies, and they were reading glossy magazines. And so
this is the sense of the title, isn't it? If we keep everything going like it is in this desolate sort of life we've got, people will be just floating like wind blown about.
That's right. That was a perspective from a man who was fully initiated. And so this alternative view was, if you like, a different mythology. And
this
so,
one,
yeah. And so the idea was to try and represent that mythology, because that was the thing that captivated people. Yeah. So I proposed the idea to Michael. He and I sat down. It was the one time, I think, where we actually sat down and actually drew up a whole list of shots. So as you can see, it's quite formally structured.
Sure.
But beyond that, I think Michael's more like a choreographer, really, where other people see something and divide it up into bits that they can reassemble. He's actually looking at it, and he's looking at movement and rhythm and the human factor behind something, and he's looking to see how he can participate. I think that's how I used to understand what he was doing.
I can imagine that very well. And so what you're talking about is a juxtaposition of the past and the present in the hope of making a different future, something like that. Is that right?
That was the idea. Well, look, there's a very plaintive line in Floating from David Naljarli, who is in effect saying we've got to do something. It wasn't clear what could be done or should be done, but we've got to try and do something. And it had to do with trying to record and acknowledge value in that other life and the set of traditions that was behind it.
Because the culture was being completely lost at that point in that community. And this is part of the reason why he was asked to come in, wasn't it?
Yes. And so back to the idea of there being 3 potential films. The past version was always an idea of evoking as much as possible a realistic sense of what daily life was like living in the bush traditionally.
And what about Lalai?
Well, that was that.
Okay, and so can you
Max has told you a bit about it after we burnt the place down. It was very hard to find foliage after that, but luckily the wind went one direction, I think. But It was quite extraordinary. The landscape, the seascape is it's just like a giant amphitheatre, and there's stillness, and so any human activity is magnified in that stillness. Mm-hmm. And it really had become terra nullius. There was no one there because everyone had been taken away. Very remote. And so the 3 older people there who came with us had been there in their youth, and they knew the place. They still had bushcraft. They could find water rippling out of dry, hard rock that we couldn't see. It was quite astonishing. They just fitted straight back in. And the place had, through the stories that they were telling, the creation story, which you'll see in the next clip, the place really had such a strong sense of presence when it was linked with that mythology, the creation ancestor spirit, Namarale, the Wandjina spirit. And we did a pilgrimage to a cave, which is like the heart of the cathedral, for want of a better analogy of that belief system. And inside this giant rock is a set of galleries and rooms. And in each room there are paintings. And that's where the old man took his son to, in effect, tell him about this history that he'd otherwise not known. Mm-hmm. And to tell the camera and to tell the world. Mm-hmm. And it was quite extraordinary. For us young guys, I mean, it was humbling, really, and to see this sort of slender but very strong thread going from deep past into the present, it was quite astonishing.
Through passing on the information and witnessing what has been.
Yeah.
So this is what you'd like to show in this film?
Yes, I think that's what
Alan, please.
About.
Lulun pengunir wudu, lulun pengunang kora cekek kari wudu, ke ngulung kuno, darat nyanir, ngulung kuno, kali pungkan wudu, menjadi kuno darat kuning, melawan wudu, ke wudu, ke jadi pun kuno melari jol pungkan iri wudu. Roy ko batyang kaya kadyana malin chilenda kaya kamnyawana nanga kaya kuning kamnyawana nanga kaya mano kawaram nyangur la panjamang kawaram nyangur la mano kawaram nangul le jamili ja aku nun ngurung ingka temalimal mano kawaram nangul lo mano kawarang kuno mama war kuno mano Amarale, kun kuwe ngeo kunjingere, keme ngun berberkali inganin cukup baca nere, coy ngun ngere, pejan ngun penere, koi ngari, malah menanggai puji pujian ngari,
Tiga ngi mere nyin ma. Namarele. Tiga ngi nyin mere. Kau ngi kunjingo. Namarele. Oro, toy mena kunjingele. Tanya de. Wudu, Indian dengan tu nono wudu, punya, wudu, nampak awak iyaru punya wudu, pandai adare wudu. Na unman bukan diri wunu ngarkan angka wunu pandai. Pelang kerana wudu.
So I just wanted to say, to clarify, I mean, just basically, you did all the initial editing on those two films, and then Espen Storm came in and did a fine cut on both of them. That's right, isn't it? And so it's sort of like it's a combination with Michael and the two of you in different ways. Look, thanks, Les. That's fantastic.
Pleasure.
Okay, could I introduce you now to Mark Gould, who's going to speak from the lectern, possibly. Wherever you want to speak from.
Okay. There's a recording studio in Caledonia Street called AM Studios, and I was lucky enough to be the carpenter who built it. It's built it in about 1981. In 1982, when it was up and running, we were marketing the studio to camera people and people who were doing commercials, and a gentleman called Michael Edols came to inspect the studio to see if it was suitable for shooting a TV scene. And yes, it was. And as we wandered out of the street, a German gentleman with a moustache wanted in and said, "What is this place?" And it was Werner Herzog, who was staying with Rebel Penfold Russell just up the road. So the three of us met and looked at the studio, and the rest is history. Years later, you saw Michael as a barrister in Where the Green Ants Dream, and that was an incidental sort of appearance, because he wasn't an actor, and there was a shit fight between the crew and the actors union, but you know, opportunism reigned. Years later, I was very lucky to be employed by the Adelaide Festival to build a theatre in a quarry in 1988 for the Mahabharata for Peter Brook's company. It was the second time I'd done this, and Peter Brook said to me, "My company are here, there's 40 of them, they haven't really got time to have an Aboriginal experience. Do you know any films that we could show them on a day off?" So I rang Michael in Sydney and said, "Michael, look, Peter Brook's in town, the Mahabharata, big Indian epic, 9-hour drama. We want to show the actors, I'd like to show them lay or floating. I'd seen those at the Filmmakers Co-op and loved them. And I said, could you post me over a VHS, please? Express post. I'll pay for the express post. We'll show them to Peter's company." Well, the next afternoon, when I went to the flat where I was living with my partner, and who was heavily pregnant at the time, and a little baby, another little baby, there was this discombobulated man wandering around the apartment, and Christine was saying to me, "Who the hell's this?" And it was Michael. And Michael had taken it upon himself to fly over to Adelaide to meet Peter Brook, because he was going to shoot the Mahabharata for Brook. That's what he decided. Anyway, there was no way that was going to happen, but we did have screenings, and as a result of all of this, he and I became friends. And shortly after that, I was cutting my first film, which was a film called Maruga to Mexico, about Ginny Lewis at SBS. And Michael came in to visit. I wanted to show him the film. So Burial Poles, 1988, the Burial Poles were on in the wharf, and Michael said, "Let's go and have a look." And we went down and had a look, and we met a gentleman up in the back row there, John Mundine, and a plot was hatched to make a film called Here's My Thumb. And really it was a testament to an Indigenous memorial. Gould came down, and Michael was directing, and he asked me to help him. Gould couldn't wrap his head around the idea of thumb, so I suggested hand. And in this sort of slightly discombobulated way Michael was, he thought with images and not words. My job as assistant director on the day was actually to translate his images to words, to Gould. English was his fourth or fifth language, which he then had to kind of translate into his own language and then wrangle it back into English. Have a look at the sequence. Thank you.
The hololog, burial pole. Tiningar kungumbur. My hand and your hands are different. My life, your lives are different. Like this, burial poles, they're all different, but they all have histories. Quack, 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 down better, hey, quack, 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 down mananga, yay, quack, 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 down majapingo, yay, quack, 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 down better, yay, right mangoranga, yay, down majapingo, yay, quack, 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 quack.
Our culture goes back, way, way, way back. Our ancestors know that.
Michael scored a really good gig just as we were making this. And he went up to shoot a film for Paul Cox called The Island. And so he asked me to handle the post-production on that film, so I did all the editing with a wonderful editor called Peter Hammond. Midnight to dawn at SBS on a punch and crunch 3/4 inch machine. That was the only shift we could get, but that's how we did it. Will Davies, I met during that period. He said, "Don't work with Michael, he's too much hassle." You'll hear from Will in a minute. But when Michael came back from Australia after having shot The Island, he had a look at "Here's my hand" and didn't ring me. I was really pissed off. And I eventually rang him and he said, he didn't like it. He didn't like it at all. And then his son Ben had a look at it and said, "Dad, it's the best film you've ever made." And all of a sudden, Michael liked the film and congratulated me.
Now I'd love to introduce to you Will Davies, who's going to come up. Where would you like to be? Over there. And Will, well, he'll tell you. Basically, have you got it on the screen? Yeah. Okay. This is another wonderfully different experience. Thanks, Will.
I'd just like to start and thank Nick and Pat and Mark. I think it's a wonderful tribute. Michael went through his life as a very quiet, I mean, in a way, a shy man. He never looked for publicity. He was a person who was modest and humble. And I think humility in the film industry is a fairly rare thing, and I always enjoyed that in Michael. But I thank you guys for taking the time to do this. About 3 weeks before Michael's passing, I can't quite remember exactly, I saw Michael and Marion because I paddle my kayak past that beautiful yacht of theirs in Pittwater. And the sad thing immediately when I heard the news was that I kept saying, and he kept saying, "We must get together for dinner. You must come to my place for dinner." He lived on a boat and I lived on the shore, and dinner would have been nice to have them both at my house. But it sadly never happened. But my story goes back even before Jennifer's in terms of knowing Michael. I was a 12-year-old boarder when I first met Michael at boarding school. And I was a little tiny kid in first year, I think we called it in those days. Michael was in fourth year. And I didn't really have a lot to do with him. He was a big kid and I was no one. And this was a fairly severe boarding house, and it was stratified and ruled with the cane, as it was in those days. And I didn't really get to know him till the following year, when my dormitory was next to Michael's dormitory, and I'd see a bit of him, and he was always a very different character. I mean, this was a time of suits and ties and boaters. And Michael never really wore his boater very well. I think it was Michael that decided one day that the thing was, in those days, to stop your boater breaking, you would fiberglass it. But I don't think he understood that with the resin you needed a hardener. So he resined the boater and put it in the roof to dry, but it never dried. And it was there sort of 6 months later with fur on it and dust. But that was one thing. So Michael passed out of boarding school and I finished. And now the other thing that interested me, he always seemed a lot older, and he in fact was. Michael had a terrible thing happen to him. And I don't quite, Marion could probably fill in the details better, but I remember him telling me, and this is not that long ago, how as a little kid of about, I imagine about 6 or 8, his mother said to him, "We're going to go to Sydney." And they lived up in Borneo somewhere. His father was a mining engineer. His father was off in the jungle somewhere. And so Mike, with his little suitcase, went down to the ship. They got onto the ship, and his mother said to him, "Look, I've forgotten something in the house. Will you run back and get it?" So Michael dutifully ran back to the house and did whatever he was told. And when he came back, the ship was gone, as was his mother, and he never saw her again. Now, this is his adopted mother, as I understand. Now, that's how traumatic is that for a 6 or 8 year old? And of course, he goes back to the house. There's no one there to look after him. His father probably didn't come back for a month. I don't know. But this sense of identity and loss must have been a theme and a part of his life. I mean, so much for Marion and the unit there was so important to Michael. But I worked on a film with him. He came to me, he knew I was interested in history. I was always fascinated in history and documentaries. No one cared. I mean, history was never a strong genre until really the coming of things like the History Channel. But that was the thing that interested me. And he came to me and he said, look, I've got this story about a Bligh descendant, this crazy man I've met up in Avalon. And he's a direct descendant of Captain Bligh. His name's not Bligh because Bligh had no sons, but through the family, this strong sense of identity, family, tradition, where all the men in the family were sea captains, every one of them. And they handed down Bligh's prayer book. Now, if you can imagine a small prayer book that went on this open boat journey with Bligh, in his top pocket was now this icon, this precious piece of history that the men of the family handed on. And this man, Ron Bligh-Ware, or Ron Ware, he called himself Bligh-Ware, was the bearer of the tradition. And he decided, probably in about 1980, 1979, that he wanted to reenact his great-great-grandfather, Grandfather Bligh called him, Grandfather Bligh's open boat journey across the Pacific. Now this intersected with my sense of history because I sort of knew a bit about it. But I think for Michael it was that he was fascinated by this lineage, this family, this ancestry and this tradition. And he was also fascinated with stories of the sea. And so he came to me and we made this documentary in 1982. It's called The Voyage of Bounty's Child. I think there's a piece here to show you the opening few minutes. But it was a great time again with Michael. I mean, I went to the Commonwealth Film Unit in 1972 and there's Michael as a cameraman, so I sort of bumped into him again in life and then he disappeared for a few years and I bumped into him again when we made this film. But we always stayed fairly good friends, distant but good and close friends. And then, of course, I went up to Pittwater up in the Northern Beaches and regularly saw Michael up there. He lived not far from me. He would come to my house. I'd paddle past the birded passage. I'd see him and wave to him. And it was a wonderful time. And it was, you never think that people are just going to disappear and go away. And my great regret, I keep thinking, I should have got Michael to dinner. I should have embraced him and he should have been there, you know. And he's, to me, a great loss. And I think, what is it now? So it must be nearly 58 odd years that I've known Michael. And this arc of my life, from a child to my old age, seeing his sons, seeing my sons, and it's a very different story to Lili and Floating and those, but it's a friendship and a producer, filmmaker relationship. And we're very fortunate in this film to get, and some of you would remember Cecil Holmes. We had this tug-of-war about how to tell the story of this boat voyage across the Pacific from Tonga to Indonesian Timor. It was just a lot of material shot on Super 8. And Michael's great idea was to blow it up to 35, and we tried it. We did all these tests. Michael was right into technology and pushing what he called the non-professional boundaries into professional areas. And I remember he had these little camera microphones. They must have been little tiny, they're things about this round, and they were on a stalk, and they would have been early video cameras of some sort. And he loved this idea of a a lens on a stalk that he could do interviews with. I love that about him. He was right out there. But anyway, a bit of the Voyage of Bounty's child. But thank you, and it's an honour to talk about him.
Thank you, Will.
Thank you, Will. This is again another area of Michael's work. Just have a look at this. It's not much. It's not very many minutes.
I, William Bligh, Lieutenant Royal Navy, had been commissioned to take command of the Bounty. We were to proceed to the island of Tahiti, there to procure quantities of breadfruit for transplanting in the West Indies. The loss of the American colonies had left our West Indian slaves almost bereft of food, for their staple diet of corn was previously imported from America. This now required replacement. The breadfruit plant had been discovered by Captain Cook and myself on an earlier voyage to the Pacific. It would seem a sensible substitute to sustain the slaves. Indeed, the merchants of London had requested this enterprise, and His Majesty had so complied. It was estimated by their lordships of the Admiralty that this whole journey would occupy some 2 years. For 300 days and nights we were to journey through fair weather and foul. Only one of the ship's company died of sickness, and I was obliged to dispense 24 lashes to another for insolence. Still, we were all in good heart, even after some 10 months at sea, when we came at last to the fabled island of Tahiti. And yet I was not to know that within those soft brown arms, behind those smiling eyes, was to be born the one creature that a captain fears and detests most: mutiny.
Introduce you to someone who doesn't need any introduction, the wonderful Pat Fiske, who's going to tell us about, I think, another sailing adventure, aren't you?
Yeah.
I'm a filmmaker, but also for a long time I worked as a sound recordist because it allowed me to continue making the films that I wanted to, and also to travel the world. I really enjoyed it. And I worked as a sound recordist on a few films with Mike. I liked working with him mostly. Sometimes he was difficult, but he was a lot of fun. He was a lot of fun to work with. And because he was so adventurous. And we worked together on Martha and Sarah's film Pursuit of Happiness, which was in Fremantle in 1987. It was part drama, part doco, and it was about a woman called Anna who became politicized by the peace movement and joined in protesting against the American nuclear warships. The film raised a lot of questions about Australia's involvement with the U.S. nuclear capacity, and the money shots were to be filmed with from a skippered yacht with Anna on one of the protest boats out there, sailing boats, and the backdrop with the American fleet coming in, huge warships and the aircraft carrier, which was immense, and on the boat were Mike, Steve Jodrell, Martha, myself, and the skipper. And it was a bit chaotic because there were all these protest boats, and we had to get the right one, to follow the right one. It was like toing and froing and trying to get in the right position for filming, and it was quite dramatic and nail-biting. Then the skipper gets his thumb caught, stuck in the winch, and nearly tears his, rips and nearly tears his, tears his thumb off. But Mike, the sailor, Mike, the cinematographer, jumps to the rescue. We're trying to hold the boat steady while he, he puts the camera down, helps the skipper with this, release the thumb, gets the bandage, gets it off, and then he just took over the helm. So then he maneuvered the yacht skillfully, like giving orders to me. I'd sailed a bit, and Steve, worked the ropes, do this, do that, do that. Got in the yacht in the right place, got Steve to be back on the helm just to hold it steady, grabbed the camera, filmed what he could, put the camera down, grabbed the helm, gave us orders, got to the right place. Same thing happened at least five times. It was amazing. I've never, ever seen anyone be so capable at multitasking in such a dire situation. It was extraordinary. I'm sorry, I'm not able to show the footage because the film hasn't been digitized yet, and there's only a VHS machine, a VHS tape, which is actually, can't see much on the tape. So, and I just want to say Martha wanted to be here tonight herself, but couldn't. She's got a very sore knee. But she did ask me to say that early on in her career as cinematographer, she was enamored with Mike's ability to handhold and wanted to emulate him. So she went up to him and said, "What's your secret? What is it? What how do you do it?" And he said, "I do Tai Chi." So, for all those young cinematographers out there, I don't think that's a bad idea. Because he could dance. I mean, really, he could dance. He was so good at hand-holding. So there are quite a few other stories I could tell about my times with Mike, like trying to have a relationship with him back in the wild days. About his reaction when I spectacularly fainted at his 45th birthday party after a champagne and a toke and fell face first into his birthday cake. I have many, many interesting memories of Mike, which I will cherish. Cherish. Vale, Mike. Thanks.
Fabulous. John, Oggy, could we introduce you to the audience and you can tell us your story?
Yeah.
John Ogden. From the ACS.
Yeah. Well, Michael and I shared a love of cinematography. Our paths only crossed professionally a few times, but we shared another passion, which I'll try to explain. It'll be a roundabout route, so bear with me. I'll try and keep it short. I'll keep to the script. So I was a bit of a late starter in the film industry, having started out as a photojournalist, amongst other things, in the early 1970s. There was a chance meeting with another cinematographer, Neil Davies, in Bangkok around 1974, to spark an interest in filmmaking. Naively, I thought about enrolling in the London Film School, but just ended up having a down and out in Paris and London experience. But while in the UK, I got my first lesson in colonial history when an irate Brit accused me of being part of the genocide of Australia's Aboriginal people. I assume he knew this just because I had an Australian accent, but it did make me feel a little bit ignorant and a little ashamed as well. He didn't learn a lot about Aboriginal culture at school in the 1950s and 60s in Australia. Thankfully, that's been improved. Long story short, I returned to Australia for the revolution after Gould was sacked, never happened, and then began literature and studies, film studies in WA in about 1977. Curious to learn more about our nation's first people, I also studied anthropology, learning about traditional cultural practice and post-contact legislation. I became both fascinated by Aboriginal culture and angry at the injustices they had suffered. After graduating, I began camera assisting on several major documentaries on Aboriginal Australia, but never on any of Michael's films. In 1981, I moved my family to Melbourne and began assisting a variety of DOPs such as Keith Wagstaff and Malcolm Richards. Mal worked with Michael on In Search of Anna. Although I got to know many of the players from the Melbourne film renaissance of the 70s, I'd missed that particular train, but they were a big influence on my generation of filmmakers. I didn't get to work with Michael until The Surfer in 1986, which was also my last gig as a first AC. I don't recall a lot of working on that production, it was the 1980s after all, but I do remember Michael's flair and creativity on a tight budget. Frank Shield was the director, supplied a clip from The Surfer which will screen after this. Cut to 2003. After 25 years in the film industry, I lost my mojo for a while. It didn't help that I lost my eye in a surfing accident and the phone had stopped ringing. I went from rooster to feather duster almost overnight. Other disasters piled up. Life became like a bad country and western song. Even my old dog died. It was time to go overseas, something new. It was in Berlin that I had a quite surreal encounter with Michael's legacy. One day I decided to walk down to Helmut Newton's Student Gallery, but got lost in the back streets, hopelessly lost. Turning a corner, I was surprised to find a typical suburban Berlin cinema with a very large banner wrapped around it announcing the Michael Edols Film Festival. It was based mostly on the famous trilogy of films. But it made me very much aware of how much Michael's work was respected abroad. Sometimes artists are more respected outside of their own countries. Let us not forget the difficulties in working with remote Aboriginal communities. Max's story spoke of some of those experiences. And I have personally experienced great generosity when working with traditional people on documentaries. But I also understand a level of mistrust and bitterness from people who have suffered many injustices and are often treated as second-class citizens in their own land. Filmmakers, and once again Jennifer spoke of this, filmmakers, especially non-Indigenous filmmakers working with Indigenous Australians, are required to have great empathy and be able to adapt to new ways of seeing, as well as having the ability to make meaningful films. Those who go in blindfolded by a heightened sense of superiority and entitlement will not glimpse the incredible spiritual power of a culture that in so many ways passes Western culture. Having worked on many low-budget documentaries and films, I have the deepest respect for those filmmakers who have the vision, drive and creativity needed to surmount the hurdles and make films of substance. Michael Edols' journey was not easy. There were numerous battles and setbacks, sometimes of his own making. But the main thing is that he got out there and documented important stories in a time of rapid change. He may have left the stage, but his films will only grow in importance and in value as national treasures as the years go by. They give insights into ancient cultures and make us think about who we are and what we are. In the early 1980s, I was truly blessed to spend time with people from the Western Deserts, including Nosebag Chuparola and a handful of Pintupi elders. They had not known about or come into contact with the European interlopers until they were initiated young men. When they were rounded up and removed from their sacred lands to make way for the testing of atomic weapons in the 1950s. Quite a lot of irony in that. These old people are all gone now. They're amongst the last of the people to live so completely in the dream time. It was only in recent years that I began to really appreciate how fortunate I was to have come spent considerable time with them and what that experience meant. When people ask me what it was, what was the highlight of your career, I don't think about famous actors or awards. I think back to that time when I was still just starting out and how generous those elders were to give me insights into their lives and beliefs. I'm sure that Michael Edols would have thought the same way about his time spent with Aboriginal communities, and perhaps even earlier when he was a boy living amongst the Dusan in Borneo. I want to applaud those who are continuing the work of Michael, the work he was doing before he died, the work to digitise the films and annotate his collection. With his passing, a great deal of knowledge went with him. Information and anecdotes have been lost forever. But I urge those who can help archive his work, and even these talks tonight are part of that, to join in before more bits of the puzzle go missing. That's my little talk, but what I want to do is also introduce...
Could I just interrupt for a second? What you've said, and what I understand is you were doing quite a lot of almost corporate work in Indigenous communities, were you?
No, I worked on a series of three-part documentaries, 3-hour documentaries. One was based on life story of Nosebag Ruler, Triumph of the Nomads, and the other one was on the Geoffrey Blaney book. Oh, that was Geoffrey Blaney book, Triumph of the Nomads. The other one was on Nosebag Ruler. There was one also in another community called Pepperminati.
Oh, yes.
So it was about 10 hours of television, I guess.
But I was going to just ask you, John, because it sort of seems to me that, like many of the crews that I've worked with too, when you go into various Indigenous communities and you're working with them, you have the opportunity to learn all sorts of things. Did you find in your early work that you had an immediate access, or did you sort of understand more as you got on in your experience in Indigenous communities, and did that sort of come to you, the understanding of what you must do or what you could learn?
Oh, I think, it takes time to get to know people. Quite often you go into communities. A lot of documentaries I worked on, the cameras didn't come out for a few weeks. You got to know the communities, you did a bit of a recce, you got to know the people. We were very fortunate with the Pintabee people to be taken to places which a lot of only a few white people had been to before. So one anthropologist of note was very surprised that we were taken there. But there was that generosity that I talk about. They were, I think people talked about before in other experiences. They really wanted to share and put that kind of, not all the knowledge, because a lot of it's quite sacred and dangerous even, but they wanted a lot of that culture to be put on the record for future generations, and that's why I'm saying I think this work's so important. But yes, it took time, and it took time to get the trust and people too. But I found the orders by and large really generous in that sharing that information.
Sure. And on the clip that we've got here from Frank Shields' film, what were you doing exactly on that film?
I was the focus puller.
For Mike?
Yeah. And like I said, I don't recall a lot about it because I was probably more worried about getting things in focus and keeping up with him. So I didn't even see the film. I don't think we had, Frank might be able to correct me, I don't even think we had dailies. From memory, I can't remember going to dailies. And I never saw the finished film. I'm going to correct that fairly soon. Frank's got a copy somewhere. He's got a little clip from the film. I think it's the opening sequence, which I haven't seen. But so I have to read Frank's work and words. So it's probably better that way because there's a strong relationship between the cinematographer and the director than between the focus puller. So I'll read Frank's words because he's seen it, I haven't. So here's Frank. It was always going to be our big opening sequence, and we set up on the roof of a tall building in Surfers Paradise. It had been raining and the light was mush. We were shot ducks. Just as I was contemplating jumping off the roof, the sky opened up, looked to Mike, and he signalled he was ready. Go! We radioed to the hero car. The crew watched as Mike followed the car down the avenue, expecting the weather to close at any second. Mike allowed the car to leave frame and began tilting slowly up to the tower as the surfers, go, go! He never panicked, he just kept panning slowly as if defying the god of light. As he got the towers into frame, as if on cue, the sky closed, a perfect one-clutch shot. So that's from Frank. That's Frank's memories.
Alan, can we see that clip? Thanks, John. Right.
We should have a deal.
What deal? I replace Jack?
Not like that. Can we help each other? I need help. Perhaps I could help you.
You don't have to do anything. I've given them up, remember? But we're stuck with each other. You can trust me, Gina, full stop. That's it. We don't have to do any deals.
Excuse me. My prop's finished now.
What do you think? Just like I bought one, eh? Would $10 be all right?
So the other thing that Frank told me, you might be here, Frank, was that he said that those two clips actually show for him what Michael represented. He said the unflappable technician in the first one, that everyone said, we can't do this, it's all closing out, the weather's going, it'll rain any second, don't even try, and he could do it. And the second one with the luminous shots of Gosia Dobrovolska, he was the artist. So that was from Frank. Okay, now, is Juno here?
Yeah.
Oh, there you are, fantastic. Okay, could I introduce you to Juno James?
I'm going to take you back a bit, back to the 70s really. For those of us who began in the 70s, and not many people know, but in the 70s, I'm under 69 actually, I spent 6 months in Central Australia as a researcher, working with McLaren on an independent film called Uluru. And the aim of that film was to tell the stories enacted on the sacred monolith in collaboration with the traditional elders who were very hard to find. And in fact, I had to go up there and find them, and they were on a fringe camp outside of Alice Springs. And when I hear Michael's story, I see a lot of commonality there, because the 70s were the time of fireside epiphanies that changed your life. Michael puts it this way, because you've got to remember that at that time, really Aboriginal people were hidden away on reserves, and most Australians knew nothing of them. They were invisible, they were silenced. And when Michael went out there, he sat down with an old fella by the one-legged Jack. And one-legged Jack said to him, just as I was sitting by the fire, as we all do, those beautiful memories that we have of sitting round the campfire after a day's work, just chewing the fat with people. And one-legged Jack said to him, you cut the land, you cut me. And Mike said that that was an epiphany to him, that it was in that moment really that he determined to be an auteur. And he said, I had a desperate need to tell the story of the unspoken people, the First Nations people of Australia. For me, it happened similarly. I was sitting by a fire, and the main Pitjantjatjara elder, the custodian for the main stories of Uluru, he said to me, we got nothing. We're not allowed to speak our language. We can't practice our culture. They've taken our land. We got nothing. And that moment changed my life too, but it changed it a little differently. And ironically, I was working on a film, but suddenly the thought that I had was, films are great, but what if people don't see it? And all of a sudden I started to see in still photographs. And I understood that still photographs were needed because they could be seen in newspapers, they could be seen in community bulletins, they could be seen on television, they could be seen in exhibition, they could be seen in books. But the real point was this, that I think that there was something in the Zeitgeist of the 70s with elders, that they felt this desperation, that the culture that they were trying to uphold against such insuperable odds there was no guarantee that it would survive. And so they had to find people like us who could hear them, who knew how to listen, who knew how to serve their intention. And that is at the heart of the collaboration that makes Leilai Dreamtime possible, that made Uluru possible. There is no other way. When people do not understand how you bring about this collaboration, it was that you understood and were willing to serve with whatever skill you could muster the desperate call that was at hand. So really, and Michael says it very clearly, he said the elders realised they had no alternative but to use the medium of film. And so what we did was we sat down on that beautiful red earth and we listened and we listened and we talked and we developed strategies together. The work you are seeing now is only possible by being created in this way. And at the deep core of it is this collaborative coming together. It comes out of the deepest respect. It comes out of knowing the privilege that you have for being there in that moment and being taught what you're taught and shown what you're shown. But when I saw Leilai Dreamtime and the absolute clarity of Michael's ability not to overlay it with anything, no interpretation, and working along with Samwin Gujjar and his family and his desire to show what the living dreaming was like to his own children in a hope of passing it on, in a hope that that would be still respected and valued. I was so moved by that work when I first saw it, and it was absolutely simultaneous to when I was seeing the rushes of Uluru. And it kind of affirmed in me a permission to work in the way we were working, because, you know, we were all out there on their own, you know, little 2-3-man teams with our 16mm Bolexes, and in our case, a geodesic tent, and, you know, we're all flying by the seat of our pants and learning so much as we went. And so when I look at the stills that I have from Uluru, I find among them stills from Leilai, because when I first saw it, I photographed those images and I held them so tight because they spoke to me so volubly. And so it was that ability in Michael, not only the depth of the collaborative work, the non-interference, the non-interpretation, but the skill and the intimacy of his camera work that moved me so much. And so in Leilai we can see through Michael's eyes in this non-intrusive, poetic, respectful, affectionate camera eye collaboratively revealing the actual reenactment of the dream time, of the traditional ways of life. And the clip that I've chosen, which we're going to play in a minute, and then I'll get on to the other bit, and that he moves also understood the pace of life. In Aboriginal community, one of the things that you have to learn pretty early on is the way things move, the time scale in which they move, the circular nature in which they move, and how he clearly went along with that, and how to all the people that we see in the film, he's not an intrusive eye, he's one of them, he's with them, he's transcribing it onto film. And the part that I've chosen is the part where Sam is laying his hands onto the child and to make them strong. And he says those words because there's always teaching, you know, do not envy, do always be upright, remember what you're told. All those things, because those things were done to my child too, and to Jenny's, I know. So can we see that film?
Ono wodo war ko myandiri umango no wangala njanda nyino nyungo da wono nyingo le ko no nyine no wono kaga ga cuman ko patema ar patono na ngala ngar kananga ke wuri yede ko patengare we ni jama wodo war ko myandiri we ni jama we kam nyawandi wa piju bungam nyandi tal jawate Andi Cina ko nyama. Nyama jadi darah mo. Wanya ko darah mo Cina. Anda kali war ngatelan Cina. Amurka. Punya ngaman. Kamu? Bakali jan. Ya anu kerja doyan ngai. Ibu orang ni nyel jalan ni albar ya. Baba. Baba. Where bana? Baba. Ya. Ay bangan. Baba. Ya, Baba. Boleh ngamnya ngera.
Just go a little bit more. It's been said, and Michael says it too, that at the time when these films came out, which was the early to mid-70s, they were pretty much neglected in Australia. They were shown at film festivals, but they were too much for people. They just couldn't get them. But however, when they were both shown actually at the Berlin Film Festival in 1979, both Wim Wenders and Werner Herzog snapped to it and really responded heavily to these films and really began the message we got was that from seeing these films, both these filmmakers wanted to come to Australia and get involved. Is the portrait that I sent over from Corinne? Is that?
I'm sorry, I don't think it's cute.
What? You
one with
didn't
the
get
cat.
it?
The one
It's not
that's in
cute.
the cat, it's in a montage. It's not selected.
Okay. Well,
That's my.
okay, so I'll finish my part and go to Corinne's. So that you know, these films did have enormous resonance around the world, as well as winning awards here. But when I think of it, I think of it of all of us who worked out in remote communities at that time, and we knew of each other, and sometimes we knew each other a little bit, or we didn't know each other. But the poets have this great idea that they're all part of a chain, and they're all part of the one tribe. And I think that we are all connected in that way, that we've all had this similar experience, and we've all in some way contributed to a major shift in consciousness in the Australian public, from knowing nothing about Aboriginal people and culture to look at where we are now, 40 years later, where Aboriginal filmmaking has a centrality, where the Aboriginal Film Unit of the Screen, whatnot, is celebrating its 25th year. But what I'm really trying to say is I really hope that we continue to honour these pioneers, to honour Michael Edols and the enormously important part he played in the history of collaboration, of creating a new cinematic language, of laying down an Aboriginal view of what the Dreamtime was. And then if we don't remember these pioneers and what they have done, then our history will again be distorted. So I think it's absolutely paramount that Michael be honoured for the work that he did and for it always to be remembered. But I've got something else, which is that as you do, I was bumbling down the road on the Camargue with a girlfriend called Corinne de Royal, and we started talking about all kind of things. We're on our way to the Camargue, and Michael's name picked up. And she said, "Oh, Michael, oh, how wonderful that you know Michael. He's a great friend of mine. I spent a lot of time with him when I was writing for Cahiers de Cinéma in Paris. So I asked her to write something that I could read to you from her."
Oh, great.
And this is what she says. "Did you know, I met Michael Edols in Paris in 1979 with Eben Storm at the Festival de Rire in the Bourbouk, where his two films, Lay Dreamtime and Floating, had a great impact, opening the eyes and the hearts of the French public to Aboriginal culture. Then we worked together on his next project, The Snake Bites the Sun, while he was also dealing with Wim Wenders and talking about where the green ants come from and the film that they were discussing together there. We had long walks in Paris with many visits to Mary Mearson at the Cinémathèque Française, where I was helping every night to welcome foreign directors. I also wrote about this for Cahiers de Cinéma. I remember him playing pool with Philippe Garel. He was very generous, cheerful and kind to me and my daughter Sarah. His teachings about Aboriginal culture opened the way to the visit of David Gould in Paris, with whom I wrote the script, The Snake Bites the Sun. Both these encounters contributed greatly at the time to introducing a different way of thinking about how souls communicate at distances without any technical devices. Best wishes, Corinne de Royal.
Hayden Keenan, he started his little bio with
Enfant terrible.
one time enfant terrible, now a gentleman filmmaker. He also, of course, made that extraordinary film that I just adored called Going Down, which was, you know, the sort of like an absolute rejection of the pretty narrative cinema that Australia had been going through for a long time, and actually, you know, because of recovering our identity as a filmmaking nation, and focusing on our history. And then he just went around Bondi and did that fantastic all-night shoot of people with David Argue and well, everybody was in it actually. Foley was in it, wasn't he?
Tracy.
Yeah, Tracy. Anyway, so but wonderful film called Going Down. He then made the next one, which was and then he worked, of course, with Esmond Storm with Smart Street Films for a long time in Bondi Junction, and they made 27A and then In Search of Anna together. But Hayden also really had something he wanted to say, and because he was actually shooting in London very recently and then a cast member died, he stayed for the funeral and said, "I'll do something on my phone, Nick." So we could play that, Alan, if you've got that, Hayden's piece to camera.
Hi everybody. I'm really sorry I can't be there for what's a very special occasion. I'm shooting in London and you know how they say what could possibly go wrong? Well, a couple of things have gone wrong and I've had to delay my return. So I hope this will suffice in replacing what I intended to say about Michael Edols. I met Michael in 1971 when we were all working at the old Commonwealth Film Unit in Linfield. I'd come up from Melbourne with my dear friend and partner in Smart Street Films, Esmond Storm, and he and I joined a rabble in the production assistants room, while just round the corner there was a remarkable camera department of which Michael Edols was a member. Now at that stage, the Araflex BL and the Eclair NPR had come into mainstream use. They'd been invented, I don't know, late 60s, 67, 68. And they were small cameras that were blimped and therefore allowed you to shoot sync sound while being able to put a camera on your shoulder. And in many ways, this created a new style of filmmaking, a truly verite school. And it was sweeping Europe, the UK, North America, the great Haskell Wexler, the Nouvelle Vague in France. They were using these cameras to tell contemporary narrative stories, some documentary, some fiction scripted stuff. And this school of filmmaking really suited Michael absolutely down to the ground. So when we set about making our first feature film, we were working class boys, while the rest of the film industry in Australia was, how can I put it, middle class. They were making tits and arse in a vain attempt to be commercial. They were making historical melodramas with slow pans across the wide brown land, or farces. And we felt no connection in general with what was going on in Australia. Our connection was with the cutting edge of what was going on internationally. People like Ken Loach, who made Poor Cow, Cathy Come Home, these punchy films that were shot contemporary, they were shot fast, they were shot with small crews. So what we did was shoot a feature film in 3 weeks. We camped at the St John of God Psychiatric Hospital just outside North Richmond, and it was the most wonderful experience, just incredible. And I'd like to show you a clip, and what it does, I think, is show Michael at his very best. I'm going to show you the whole clip. It's 2.5 or 3 minutes long, because this is not about the ability of a cinematographer to hand hold. This is the ability of a cinematographer to plug in to the narrative. Michael always shot this sort of stuff with both eyes open, one in the viewfinder and the other would be checking what was happening. And as you'll see, this is the editor's dream. It needs maybe one splice in 3 minutes, and it's as good, I think, as you'll see anything, anywhere in the world, as Michael tunes in to the two artists who are acting the show and performs some choreography that is absolutely unforgettable.
Good morning, Mr. Donald. Go and make your bed and we'll go and clean up, huh? I'm not leaving this room until you find somebody to bring here who knows what's going on.
Come on, Mr. Dunn, it's a nice sunny day. What's the
All
matter?
right, Smith. I'll attend to Billy. He's just not cooperating at the moment. Sleep well, Billy.
I'm not leaving here
A
until
lot
you...
of things you've got to learn,
until
and I'm going to
bring
teach you.
somebody you...
One of the most important, of course, is basic hygiene. Every morning we go to the wash house and we wash ourselves. Now, tomorrow morning, I want you to be able to do it yourself. We work together in this little hospital, Billy. Everyone pulls together. It's up to you to cooperate. Now, I can understand you might be confused every now and again. Take a little bit of time to settle in, won't it? But around here, Billy, come on, man.
Don't drag me!
It's not very far now, Billy. But we will work together here, won't we, Billy? And tomorrow you'll be able to do this yourself, won't you now? I shouldn't have to do this, you know, Billy. Other people want to see me too. And so here. That's all right, Billy. Now, off with your jacket. Off with your jacket. Come on. Oh, come on, Billy. I don't have to undress you in front of all these people, Billy. There we are. Come on, get out of there. Come on.
What do you want from me?
Look at all these men. They're laughing at you, Billy. Come on now. You get inside. Come on, get out of there. Right, now. Here we go, Billy. Get out of there, Billy. There you go, Billy. Oh, look at that. Oh, watch your ass, Billy. That's all right, Billy. Come on, now. I don't have to do this every day. Come on. Other men need my attention too. You're being very selfish, Billy. Don't you now? But it's why I'm fussing after you, Billy. Other people are being neglected. That's all right. Right your own house, Billy. Put on your jacket now, Billy. Everything's all right. No trouble. Come on, put the trousers on, Billy. You're not a small boy, you know, son. Come on. That's enough of you. Go in there. Come on, dress yourself.
Another fucking pervert.
Get in there. Come on, Billy. There we are. You're a grown man, Billy. Look at all these men. They're washing themselves. There we are. Right. There we are.
Nutcases.
That's all right, Billy. We're all nutcases in this place, Billy. Including you. There's a routine here, Billy. The sooner you learn it, the better off we'll all be. You, me, and the hospital. Right. Come on, Billy. Back we go. Can you remember the name now? What? Can you remember the way back, Billy? Round here. Tomorrow, you do this yourself, right? Because, Billy, I don't like having to do it. I've got other things to do, Billy. The sooner you relate to us, the sooner you get out. The sooner you're well. That's what we all want, isn't it?
You don't care what to
Do
do.
you understand? While I'm attending to you every day, Billy, I can't treat other patients. Do you understand, Billy? Now, I'm going to isolate you in your little room very shortly because you're just not cooperating. And the sooner you start cooperating, the sooner you get out of here. And that'll make us all happy, won't it, Billy? Right? That's it. Now, you just stay there, but if there's anything you really want, just give us a call because, after all, that's why we're here.
Well, I still find that really exciting to watch. After 40 years, it's visceral, it's plugged in, it's electric cinematography, I think. And if any international cinematographer of the first quality had a look at that, they'd know that Michael was part of their peer group. It's Michael at his very best. And I think he developed the process even further when he made his own films, Lalai, Floating, Titikawa, all those things really, Michael telling a story with a camera. And I think those films will stand up for a long time. When I'd heard that Michael died, I felt sad and I was taken aback, as you'd expect. But then those feelings started to be replaced by a sense of anger, a sense that in the Australian film industry, in the straight-jacketed culture, there was no space for a Michael Edols to pass on his wisdom and his experience and his ideas to the crew coming in behind him, which is what a healthy industry and culture should be doing. And, you know, the Soviet-style commissars that decide what gets made, that run our culture, talk never-endingly about, we want passion, we want people who will challenge. That's bullshit, man. Complete bullshit. They don't want passion. They want a modicum of enthusiasm that they can control. Mike Edols was passionate. Getting near passion can be dangerous, as the commissars know well. There can be blood on the walls because passionate people take no prisoners. They will not stop until they get to the end. and achieve what they've set out to do. And consequently, I think it's a shame that Michael didn't have that opportunity in the film industry, but at the same time, boat building got a committed craftsman, and it sounds like he was extremely happy doing that. So for me, I want to say, Vale, Mike Edols. You're a champ, you're a committed, passionate cinematographer, and you'll be greatly missed.
Thank you, Hayden. Now, could I ask Marion, would you like to come up and sit down here? Take these. So, here we have Marion van der Dreischen, Edols, and I think what you'd like to start by reading some of his backstory, is that right?
Yes, I thought I'd write it down because in actual fact the backstory is quite long and complicated, so I thought if I wrote it down I could put it in a concise way but hopefully get across to the essence of what I felt made Michael the survivor and the person he was. But I actually wanted to start, it's interesting you say that Michael didn't have the chance to pass on his knowledge as he would have loved to have done. But he did in many different ways because he did influence a lot of young people. He met Catriona Mackenzie in New York in 1998, and this is what she wrote to me the other day. I received this, she wrote, he was the most beautiful man, curious, complex, and an occasional pain in the ass, and I will miss him very much. And I thought that summed up very well Michael's effect on people because he did have a lasting effect on many people and was loved by many. To understand Michael and how he came to dedicate his life's work to making films with Indigenous people, I think you need to look at what he called his backstory. Many of you probably know parts of it. So in his early life, from the moment of his conception in Rawalpindi, from a bigamist marriage between his mother, Dorothy Hewitt, half Parsi and half English, and his father, Ernest Smith, a middle-aged British officer, Michael's life was never going to be uncomplicated. Needless to say, after they moved to Sydney and Michael was born in 1942, the marriage didn't last, and Michael was adopted by an engineer from Forbes, Ted Edols, who had married a Sydney model, Betty, and whisked them both away to the Far East. First Vanuatu, and when Michael was about 3, up the Sagama River to Borneo, where Ted built roads, bridges and outdoor cinemas for British Tobacco. There were 2 major influences in Michael's early life which formed the man he was to become. Firstly, his father Ted, and secondly, his neighbours, the Indigenous people of that region, the Marot. Ted Edols was your typical country larrikin, a big man with big hands and a big heart, who respected the local people and who passed on to Michael a love of learning, adventuring, inventing and problem solving. Within the jungle environment, Michael was also adopted by the Marot, who in their longhouses passed on to him a spiritual way of being, a love of storytelling and mythology, and a deep respect for their culture and the elders who gently guided and taught him their ways. It was a rude shock then when at the age of 10 he was sent to an Australian boarding school. I'm sure Ted was in terrible conflict over this decision, as by this time Betty had left him and he was on his own. For those who wanted to know, Betty ran away with the Dutchman. Michael found that there were many Dutch people in his life, including me. Even Ted Edols, the Edols family were Dutch, so he had a bit of a thing about being somewhat persecuted by Dutch. Sorry, I'll go back. It was a rude shock then when at the age of 10 he was sent to an Australian boarding school, and I'm sure Ted was in terrible conflict over this decision, as by this time Betty had left him and he was on his own. But it was a crucial time for Michael, because the Marut elders had approached Ted and said Michael was ready for the first stages of initiation, so a decision had to be made. One can only imagine the culture shock of leaving the lush green jungle smells and arriving in the dry and comparatively barren landscape of Australia, and surrounded by the smells of lanolin, mutton and dripping on bread. Michael continued to return to Borneo during the summer breaks until Ted's passing when he was about 14. I believe his resilience must have come from these formative years, because all his life he spoke of Ted and the Marut with deep affection. Adversity can be, however, the very catalyst for growth and development, and it was the words of a teacher which began Michael's love of photography. They were, "Michael, you have a wonderful imagination, but you shouldn't tell lies." Michael had told the class of the annual tidal wave which brought a wall of debris down the Sagama River when the spring snows melted. Having been taught to respect one's elders, his recourse was to ask for a camera as a Christmas present so that he could prove his world was true. And I found it the other day. It was in his treasure box. I didn't realise that he still had it. So he obviously treasured it.
Could I just, I know that we're running very much out of time at this moment. Could I get you to tell us perhaps when he started making the Kimberley films, when he first met Sam, when he went up there for the first time, what did he find and how did he start that whole process of the Kimberley stories?
Well, what I've heard Michael tell over the years was that he'd been invited by Professor Derek Freeman to Canberra, where they showed Titikawa and Friends, and then he was invited back for a cup of tea. And I think Les was with them. And when they were there, they found that there was a tribal elder, Albert Barunga, and...
He's on the screen.
Yeah. Yes.
Great.
And Professor Derek Freeman announced that he was going to adopt him as his brother. He went off to the kitchen to make a cup of tea, and Michael said to Albert Barunga, "Well, what do you think of Professor Freeman?" He said, "Oh, like a big white rock, can't get over him, can't get round him." And then he said to Michael, "Good film?" And Michael said, "Oh, you saw Titikawa and Friends?" He said, "Yeah." And he said to Michael, "We need a good white fella film man." And he invited Michael to go up to Mounjum, which I believe Michael did on at least 2 occasions, and I think Ben, did you go with him on 1 occasion? I think so. Yeah. And that was so he could be observed during that time. So it wasn't that, it was understood that he would do this. He was there to be observed and the elders to make a decision. During his time up there, he came across an old man, Sam, who was caulking a boat, and Michael had made boats as a young man to earn a living, and so he had a natural affinity with Sam, and they got to know each other and become friends during that period. And so finally one day the elders asked Michael to come and sit down with them. I think they'd already explained what they had wanted the films to be, that they wanted to show the young people a mirror, to show what was happening to them and to give them a sense of what they would lose if they didn't listen to the elders. So when Michael sat down with them, they said that they wanted him to be their film man, and then they pointed to a man walking towards them and said, and this will be the person that you'll collaborate with. I'm sure they didn't use that word, but they would have explained, and it was Sam. And Sam was a songman, probably one of the last, and he was the one that held the knowledge and the right to repaint the Wanganets. So their friendship had begun already before he found out. And he was given a skin relationship that was important. In order to collaborate with Sam, he was made his skin brother, which meant that Michael had duties and responsibilities to the rest of the community as well.
What did he understand his responsibilities were, his sense of custodianship? Can you explain it a little?
Yes, well, he became the custodian of the material in the films and the stories that they told, and he was told that was his duty, to ensure that this heritage remained available for future generations. And he took that very seriously. I think the word is kukai, which means custodian, and David Maljali spoke of that also, I think, in When the Snake Bites the Sun. So the role of custodian meant that we had to digitise the films, because that was the only way that they could remain available for future generations. And so in the time that we were together, that's what we did. Do you want me to talk about the Galengala project now? I mentioned that? Or?
Before that, could I just ask you about the hiatus? There was...
will
we get thrown out, panel?
Yes, we will.
We will?
Yeah, we
oh,
will.
okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So much.
Well, can I just
Riches, but please mention the Galengala project. Please talk about that.
Yes. The Galengala project, Michael and I had been working on for the last 18 months, and Michael gifted all of the film archives and sound archives to IATSIS, which is Australian Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island Studies. And he did that and requested that they digitise the material, which they did. So there's 35 hours of film from probably about 6 different films, and 100 hours of sound. So the aim was to ensure that that material could be returned to those people whose elders, who's the voices of those elders. Michael was going to use his original field notes, and we were going to select, edit, annotate, and hopefully find a means of putting it online. It's quite tragic.
Any help that anybody can think about of how to...
There is someone here, Sarah Yu. Can Sarah have a minute to say something, because Sarah is a curator from Broome, Peter Yu's partner, and would you like to mention something at this point?
Sarah, if you could come to this microphone so we can hear you. Thank you so much. Great.
So I've been talking with Sarah, because we spoke with her at great length some months ago about the project. So Sarah's just a brief...
Thank you. Sarah, you.
Okay, thank you. In case you don't know, I live in Broome and I work with the Yara people, but I worked in the Kimberley for 40 odd years, and I met Michael when he first came up, and it's been lovely hearing more about the cinematography. I know more about the sort of cultural kind of films that he made from the local perspective rather than the whatever the word is, cinematographic thing. But I guess what I really just wanted to say was that there's a lot of talk about loss today, and about the concern that those elders had about losing things. And I just wanted to say that there's just a very strong movement at the moment in the Kimberley around this whole idea of repatriation, taking things back. And in fact, not just taking them back, things seem to be sort of finding their way home. And so it was just by accident that I met Michael at the beginning of this year again, after a very long period of time. But there really is a need to repatriate this material. And getting it to the Institute, getting things digitised is one thing, but it's getting it back to the community that's really important. And that's what the Galangala project was about. And so I'm just here really to urge, if we can find a way of doing what Marion was talking about, which is about getting the information back. And the thing is, things didn't die. They've kept going. And if you go to Marion now, there's a lot of tragedy and so on. But there's also a wonderful arts centre there. In Broome, we have started speaking Yarru again. It was supposed to be dead and dying, but now there's a group of people who speak the language. There's records of the language being spoken. So, this is just a call really to somehow find the funds that are required for this sort of work, to actually do the work and get it back to this next generation of people. And really that's all I wanted to say.
So is there a possibility that there is a forum where we can contribute? Is there something we can find to publicise the need to do this and how to call for it?
I think there's organisations that are starting to do their own archives in the Kimberley. Well, this is in the Kimberley, obviously. That was a major part of Michael's work. So there are organisations there to partner with. I'm quite happy to help put people in contact with the right sort of people. But I mean, my interest in Michael's stuff was he actually came through Broome and made it, incidentally took lots of photos of his time when he was in Broome. A lot of people pass through Broome. It's sort of one of those places where they were going to the real Kimberley, but they all pass through Broome. So we're hankering after this sort of material so that we can. I'm just an agent. I'm not Yarru, but I do work with young people. But there's just such an urge for this, and I think I'm a bit emotional because I've just come from talking about the repatriation of human remains, and that's something that is kind of happening as well. But it is about these things finding their way home, and whilst it's lovely to talk about it all in this forum, some of that material is deeply cultural and deeply meaningful, but the people there's a dislocation still between the material and the community. So we just have to find a way to make them and to support it and fund it. There's organisations now that can hold that material and bring the young people in to see it. And that's what those Sam and people like that's what they want.
Thank you very much. We are well over time, and that means we do have to leave. I'm so sorry that we couldn't get the open microphone session going, because I'm sure there's so many questions all of us have. We're going to have to store them up and deal with those in other ways. How do you suggest? Well, I mean, basically, keep it all in mind. This has been filmed, as you've noticed, and that's going to be on what's it called, Pat? The OzDox. Oh, she's left. The OzDox YouTube. OzDox YouTube. It'll be on that, and please feed back into that. If you'd like to say something, if you'd like to add, if you'd like to question or comment, please feed back through the OzDox YouTube and any other way you can. And I just wanted to thank the people that have helped us all. Of course, the film school with the projection and the facilities. Pat, of course, Mark, of course, the sponsors of the ACS,
OzDox itself, Andrew Pike and Ronin Films.
Directors Guild?
Yeah, the ADG, the Directors Guild, of course, I'm sorry, and there are so many people to thank. But basically, if it's possible, please come along to the upstairs bar at the... Not upstairs bar, sorry, downstairs bar. Well, anyway, we can get in at the Bavarian beer hall down the road. And I wanted to mention that Andrew Pike of Ronin Films has got Aspects of a Life, that wonderful book and DVD package of Michael's work that you can buy. He will have, probably Andrew will take some with him if he goes, I think, down to the beer hall. But basically, it is available now, and it's a fantastic. It contains so much information about Michael. Isn't that book wonderful?
And there's also a 20-minute interview that Andrew
did himself
with Michael, which is also excellent.
Nick, I think we should run the last clip.
Could we do it, do you think?
Yeah,
I'd love to.
Let's run the last clip.
All
It's
right.
only a couple of
Alan,
minutes.
could you just actually run that very last clip, which I've called Snake Son? I think it was 37. Because this was the idea, was that I wanted to show this at the end with Marion's blessing, because it's actually Michael talking.
Very personal, very personal.
And very personal.
It's impossible to describe the anguish of having the old man die in my arms. While I was in his presence, the world about me was inconsequential. The memory of this is the driving force of my quest. My closeness to Samuel Ogden was so great that things were possible for me that my white culture had taught me were impossible. My culture had always demanded proof, not stories. The old man had told me the story of how his ancestors had come from the land of fiery mountains, poling themselves along on rafts when the islands were knitted together, and arrived on this continent. In 1979, I was in the Philippines seeking scientific proof of this story. While I was there, a completely unscientific but a completely real event occurred. Samuel Ogden appeared to me, not as a vision, but as real as life itself. And yet he was meant to be somewhere else, a long, long, long way away. I suppose the most extraordinary thing was that this was made very evident to me, because when I saw him next after that phenomena, I saw the same thing, and that was that he had blue eyes and white hair. It wasn't as though I'd seen him like that before. I'd never seen him like that before. I didn't even really think about that event. I just naturally knew that I had to go back to his home. And that's what I did. I caught the next plane back to Australia. I went straight to Derby Airport and walked from the airport into the Marion community. And I was about 100 feet away from the old man's house. And suddenly I saw the silhouette rising, and the old man called out to me, "Thought I nearly lost you this time. Thought I nearly lost you." And I asked during that time why it was that he called me. And he said, "You tell the stories now. It's time for you to tell the story." I said, well, how can I do that, old man? I'm not initiated tribal man. He just laughed. You have to tell the stories now. My sons are too drunk, and our people are too much humbug. It was a very special moment.
Well, I hope this has been as full of meaning and emotion for all of us as it has been for me. And I think it's been a fantastically valuable session, and I really want to thank all the speakers who've come and shared their knowledge and their memories and their insights into Michael in all those ways, why he did it, how he did it. But at the moment, I just want to thank you all and please invite you to, if you want to have a drink to Michael, come down to the Bavarian Beer Hall. Thanks for coming.